So on some level, this is the end of our Understanding Judaism class. The Understanding Judaism class has turned into sometimes a two-parter where we do the morning and then in the evening, we do a slightly different chunk of things. We'll see how far we get in this. We're still using the textbook, the Every Person's Guide to Judaism, but it's the old version of the book and not the new version of the book. I really do like how succinct this is. I want to start with, so we are officially scheduled then to talk about everything from death, which we didn't talk about a lot when we did the life cycle things, and then God, and then prayer, and then Midrash, and then contemporary Jewish life and Jewish community. I think we could do all of that in 40 minutes. Why not? So I wanted to start with this though, because I think that this surprises some people. On page 116, I'm going to read some of this so that we can discuss it. It tells us that Judaism is a life-affirming religion that focuses on the here and now. And then I'm going to skip down to people look to religion to answer such ultimate questions as what happens to us after we die. Judaism doesn't have one answer to that. There are a number of things that we say. It's saying here, while some individual Jews may believe that dead is dead, that there's nothing, Judaism asserts, it says, that death is not the end. And that's very interesting. If you ask most of my congregants over a certain age, the ones who study with Dr. Brill, he used to say, we don't have to worry about what happens after we die, about heaven and hell, because right now we're living on hell on earth. Because he was rabbi during Shoah, during wars, during some terrible times. Rabbi Lefkowitz was officially a rabbi here. He didn't stop being the rabbi, but he was also a chaplain in the military. So he left to be the chaplain, and they brought in Dr. Brill. He was a rabbi, but they always called him Dr. Brill. But anyway, he taught people, and the generation of people who he taught, who are now mostly in their 90s, they are okay knowing that this life is all we've got. It's really okay with them not to have to think that there's something beyond this, and that you're taught to be good in this life, because being good is good. It's not about reward and punishment. It's not about reward and punishment in this life, although you like to think that if you do good things will happen. There's a little bit of a karma sense there, but you've also seen good things happen to bad people. And you've also seen some people that you would consider bad seemingly to succeed. And Jewish history teaches us some stories, like when you get rabbis who all they did were devout and good and practiced, chesed, loving kindness, and then they get burnt at the stake. You wonder what happens. There's got to be a reward somewhere, and those are the time periods when Jews would tend to believe that there's reward after life. So in this book, it talks about some concepts of afterlife, and I wanted to discuss that, and it's really succinct. I love how it does it. It says virtually every concept of the afterlife that you could possibly imagine has at one time or another found its way into Jewish tradition. It doesn't say that you could possibly imagine. I don't want to know if you could possibly imagine something beyond what's here. This is good enough. An early biblical concept is that of Sheol, which was understood as a kind of a nether world, a world of shadows where the deceased were thought to dwell, whatever dwell meant. Remember when there were times when the earth would open up its mouth and everybody'd fall into Sheol? What was that? We don't know. Is that a dwelling place? Where I kind of expected everybody to be squished at the end of that, and that there wasn't a dwelling thing after that. A later view was that of something called Gan Eden, which is literally the Garden of Eden, paradise, and Gehinnom, which is literally the Valley of Hinnom. It was a place of punishment. I want to tell you that in Arabic, the words Jana and Jana, one means Garden of Eden and one means hell. And both of them sound like my name. It's kind of embarrassing. Or it could be an easy way for you to remember how to say my name. I don't know. Nobody calls me Jana. You're going to call me Jana or Jana. A later view was that, these indicate a concept of reward and punishment after death. The idea of Gan Eden or Gan Gan Eden, we'll call it that way, suggested that the righteous would be returned to a perfect primordial place. That's the Garden of Eden. Gehinnom is named for an actual place outside the old city of Jerusalem, where in biblical times, the pagan inhabitants of the land offered their children as sacrifices. Thus, that site acquired the reputation of being the most abhorrent place imaginable. While Gehinnom was considered a place of punishment, the sentence was for a limited period, not an eternal perdition. The notion of reward and punishment in the afterlife, referred to as Olam Haba, which means the world to come, underlies many of the teachings in the Talmud and the Midrash. So even when all you believe is that now is what matters, the Talmud still will teach us about Olam Haba, the world to come. It will talk about there are commandments that you do that you'll only see a reward in the world to come, that it's not necessarily going to reward you now for doing it. What does that mean? I mean, there's not supposed to be like point system to the midrash, to mitzvot, to commandments. So that's one, the world to come. One of my favorite stories about world to come is that we get to be students with God as our eternal teacher. Imagine that any question that you could possibly ask, you will have an opportunity to raise your hand in class and say, well, how long was a day on those first days? And raise your hand again and say, why did you keep the mosquitoes? And so you get to ask any question you want. So part of what motivates me in life is, if any of that could possibly be true, that we could possibly be students and God is the teacher in this eternal class, then I don't expect to be the smartest person in the class. I don't expect to be the person, by smartest, I mean the one that has all the answers. I don't expect to be that person, but I don't want to be the dumbest one either. I don't want to be the one that has no answers. I want to try. I want to have some of those answers when I get there. So we get to that. And then it says, the concept of physical resurrection, the bodies of all those that died will be brought back to life on earth again, is found in the Talmud. According to traditional belief, this resurrection is to take place when the Messiah comes. So we actually bury people with, normally in Shreveport, the heads are buried toward the east, so that you know which way to go when the Messiah comes. We're all marching back to Jerusalem. But wait, like, we're also supposed to be buried so that we can have an ashes to ashes, dust to dust experience. How are we supposed to march if we've already deteriorated to the ashes to ashes state? And the answer is, I don't know. I had a guy who, there's some answers there. It's not, there is a guy who came to bury his father, and the mother, the wife of the deceased, did not want to see the casket lowered. So there are some Christian services, there's some few cemeteries, they will not let you lower the casket while anyone is watching. She did not want to see the casket lowered. She wanted to leave. The son wanted to be there to bury the father. That's a mitzvah, it's a commandment. We even put the dirt on the casket, and he wanted to do that. He left Shreveport, married a woman from a conservative movement, wound up being conservative, and wound up being the chair of his cemetery committee. So the mom leaves, the funeral directors come to help roll the casket over the hole so that we could lower the casket. She didn't even want to see it near the hole. And they said, wait, the head is over here. And he said, no, the head is supposed to be, so he wanted the head on the west side and the feet on the east side. So that way, when the Messiah comes, you stand up and you keep walking, as opposed to your head. Like, I'm looking at it and I'm like, every single body, even the Christians are buried with their head on the east side. But if this is how you do it, you may be right. I'll tell you what, I'll look it up. And when Messiah comes, if we were wrong, I'll come back and I'll turn your dad around. Or maybe there's less traffic if he goes the other way. We'll figure this out. But there's this concept of them bones, that God can make those bones come back up and walk. Then there's a concept of reincarnation. It's existed for many centuries. Some religions have wholeheartedly embraced it, while others have thoroughly rejected it. While it's not specifically a tenet of Judaism, there is a precedent within Judaism for accepting the idea since a belief in reincarnation is found in many Jewish mystical texts. There's that's something that I may want to talk about. We may do another whole class about what happens after you die, because I found some interesting reincarnation concepts. When we're doing the About Faith series on Red River Radio, and by the way, Marcy, who's on here right now, is the host of that. When we do that, one of them, the faith people, is a Hindu who has great concept of reincarnation that's built into their life system. Judaism's concept of reincarnation is not the same as theirs. In Judaism concept, for example, you don't get to like be a dog one time and a cockroach one time, and it's not like trans species. It stays in one species, but I don't know. But then we get to this. Judaism asserts that the soul is immortal. Upon the death of the body, the soul returns to its source. This is expressed in the Bible in the words of Ecclesiastes. The dust returns to the earth as it was, and the spirit returns to God who gave it. Many Jews today hold a view that we live on through the deeds we've done and in the memories of the people whose lives we've touched. Judaism recognizes that for human beings, memory is a very potent force. The book of Proverbs says, the memory of the righteous is a blessing. On the basis of this verse, it's customary when mentioning the name of one who's died to add the phrase, Zichrono livracha, or Zichrona livracha, may his memory be a blessing, or may her memory be a blessing. You may see in Hebrew the Zion with the double chupchik and a lamed, which is the abbreviation for Zichrono or Zichrona livracha. Sometimes you'll see with a tzadi in there to say, may the righteous memory be a blessing. In English, sometimes people would write O, B, and then the double chupchik and M, which stands for a blessed memory. All right, so those are a little bit of the concepts of after death. I'm not going to talk about funeral. That's a whole long thing in itself, what we have to do and how we get ready for it. So we're going to move on to God. Anybody want to talk? So just to kind of recap a little bit where I am in this. I do love the idea that God created humans by clumping the clay from the four corners of the earth and breathing with God's nostril up into the nostril of that human shape, and that there was this spark of life that comes from God, and each human being has that spark. And I think that spark doesn't ever go out, and that spark lives on forever. It wouldn't surprise me if the spark was able to go into another body and relive for whatever reason. It wouldn't surprise me. It's not necessary, but it wouldn't surprise me. But I believe that there's a spirit that lives on, and I believe that we actually get messages from that spirit if you look for them. I mean, I know there are times when there's a butterfly, and there can be lots of butterflies. I could see a butterfly and say, well, that's lovely. Look, it's a yellow butterfly. And look, it stopped on the car, or it stopped on the flower. But then there are times when you see a butterfly and it makes you think of grandma, and you smile and you realize that there's a message there that says it's all okay, or whatever it was that it's in your heart. You're going to hear it if you're open to it. So I believe that. Lexi?
So my favorite thing that I found the last two lines, and one of the lines goes, God has you in his arms, or God has you in his keeping, and then the last line, I have you in my heart.
So I don't know what the source of that is, Lexi. I mean, it may be lovely, and I'm glad you're finding comfort for him. It doesn't specifically sound like a Jewish comfort.
Basically, it starts out, and I don't have it.
So my point is, yeah, so I'm just talking here, this class, we're talking about Jewish things to do, and I can tell you what Jewish songs of comfort are, but
it starts out with basically a person passing.
Okay, there are lots of ways of finding comfort. But this is we're going to be talking about the Jewish concepts for this one, and it sounds like a beautiful, comforting song. I'm not saying it's not Jewish. It could be Jewish, but I'm saying that sounds like, it sounds to me like there's a Christian source to that one. And I may be wrong. If it turns out that everything in there is quoting from Psalms or Job or something, then I could be wrong, but it doesn't sound like that to me. When you talk about holding in your arms, that feels like a physical manifestation of God that is not typically the way people refer to God. There are a few very specific times when we see a physical manifestation of God referred to in Torah, and it's not supposed to mean literally. And obviously in this case, it's not necessarily literal either. God writes on the tablets with God's finger. God blows with God's nose into this human. But I do not recall, and I may be wrong, somebody else may think of it, but I don't recall ever hearing in Jewish texts that we are embraced and folded in God's arms. I don't remember. I remember there was a quote that I wanted to put on a talit that was about the wings of the guardian angels that are protecting us. That's a different story, and that felt good. But that's about as close as it got. Anyway, sorry. I'm sorry I had to cut you off, but we have very little time, and all of this still, we're on page 127 and we have to get up into the 180. So 60 pages in 30 minutes, and we got this. There's a good overview about what God is in Jewish tradition. One of my favorite things to think about for God, there was a session that I went to of the Institute of Southern Jewish Life, where we have these educator sessions, and they taught about the fact that as we age and as we change, we each individually have a different relationship with God and concept of God. So that when we're younger, we're trying to understand life, and sometimes it winds up being a more physical kind of a thing that we think of God. When we picture God, there's like a beard and a guy and white hair and I don't know what. Or as you've heard me say many, many, many times, sometimes you get the 5-year-old who says, hey, if God is everywhere, is that true? And you say, yes, God is everywhere. And they say, well, is God in my peanut butter sandwich? And then you know it's a trap because there is no right answer there. Because if you say yes, then he may never eat peanut butter sandwiches again. Or if you say no, then God isn't everywhere, and that blows their brains. And so, but they really do need to think of God and figure out where God is in comparison to the physical world, because they are at a stage in their life where they're trying to understand where the me ends and the you starts and where everything ends. And so we lost Lexi. I don't know what happened. But so what I learned was that the concept of God changes over the years. And we've talked a little bit about that through the years. And this has an interesting, the way, okay, here she comes. It's got an interesting intro to it to remind you, because it's one of the other things we're going to be talking about is prayer. But it says one of the most important prayers begins with Baruch atah. I'm going to say Ad Hashem Elokeinu Velokei Avotenu Veimotenu Elohei Avraham Elohei Yitzchak Velohei Yaakov. So it says, praised are you, Adonai, God of our ancestors, God of Abraham, God of Isaac, God of Jacob. If it were an English composition class, you would fail, because you should concatenate all of those and say God of Abraham, God of Isaac, God of Jacob, and just say God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob instead of showing the God of. And what it tries to teach us is that Judaism affirms a belief in one God. There's a message here. There's only one God. Each generation, Abraham, whose son was Isaac, whose son was Jacob, and in fact, each individual understands God differently, may have a very different relationship with God. God doesn't change. God is always God. Our understanding of God, our relationship with God changes, and that is okay. That's allowed in this whole thing. In fact, I'm going to say that at least since I was 15, so maybe this doesn't work for every generation, but since I was 15, I think that there's probably most people who think about God at all have moments in their life when they wonder if there's a God at all. And I'm going to say that possibly most Jews since the Shoah, since the Holocaust, have a moment where they say, how could there be a God who let that happen, who made it happen, who whatever, that there comes a point where you even challenge God, and that's okay too in Judaism. So they're going to talk about here, there is really only one God. That's really important, that there's only one God. That stays the same. And that the God that we have is not ever a person, and doesn't get to share God's self with others. And this is not a critique of any other faiths. One of the things that I personally love about Judaism is this mi chamocha ba'elim Adonai concept. Who is like you among the gods, Adonai? Like, I get that there are other gods. I get that people try to worship other gods. I get that. I believe that there's only one true God. I say, and I am sometimes told that I'm wrong and crazy for this, but I say that if you pray to the tree God and the tree God answers, I think that the one God is answering you, and that the tree God is, just a way for you to get to it, but not that there are more than one gods. I don't believe that there are more than one gods. I think that there's only one God. So some people get mad at me when I talk about tree gods answering you, but I think that that's perfectly acceptable in Judaism. So then we turn to page 128 in mine. It talks about the monotheism, which obviously Shema Yisrael, listen Israel, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai, which is our nickname for God. Eloheinu means our God. So we're not only talking about God, but we're tying ourselves together to everyone else, all the other Jews in the world over all time. Adonai Echad, Adonai is one. So monotheism is a really important thing. God is unique. God has no parents, no offspring, no spouse. Although God is always conceived of as one, God is referred to by lots of names. That's a class that we should do on our own. I think that there's one counting of 72 different names. The one name that I consider the name of God is the Yud He Vav He name, which is sometimes represented with the YHVH. Sometimes people try to sound it out, and then I say, I'm embarrassed for you, because God says, don't take God's name in vain. So just leave it alone. It's really okay. We have lots of ways of talking about God. We're not saying you can't have access to God. It's just saying, here's a name you're not going to use. The second thing is that God is not physical. And not only is it not physical, is God not physical, but we're taught in the Decalogue not to make a representational form of God. Sometimes it will say, and this is important, this is what I was talking about a minute ago, that God has human attributes like the face of God or the voice of God. The language may be used. The real underlying message is that God has no physical form that exists or can be represented. In fact, God is not restricted to any natural phenomenon. This really powerful quote by Elijah was looking for God. It was the depths of needing God, and realized that God wasn't in the wind. As powerful as the wind and the earthquake and the fire feel, God was the still small voice in the conscience. That's where he found God. God is in nature and history, the creator of the universe. God spoke and it was, and God commanded it endured. That's part of what I love about the creation story, is the fact that what creates the world is God using letters and words. That just blows my mind. We know that God intervenes directly in history. If we know that God saved us from Egypt, then we know that that was God doing something in history. And that's when you start to wonder. I'm going to tell you, I wonder. Because you ask questions like, well, why didn't God just pluck us right up and plop us out? Why did we have to go through these plagues? Why were people suffering? Why did we have to deal with the 40 years? And in hindsight, I think we realized that there are all these lessons that we needed to learn, and this was really a helpful way of doing it. We can't pretend that we know better than God what should have happened, could have happened. I challenge you to, when I'm teaching Torah study, I'm always asking, who are you in the story? I challenge you to try to imagine in one day, imagine you were God in one day and figured out what way you think life should be today, just for you, just as far as you live. And you'll realize that it's not as simple as, why wouldn't God just pluck us right out? Because there are so many repercussions that come out of it. Um, we saw this adorable show this week. I think I told you that we're watching this show called Summer Camp Island. It's on HBO Plus, and it's little 11-minute shows. It's rated TV 7, so there's magic in it and stuff. And sometimes it's not scary to me whatsoever. But these little kids are at camp, and and there's a king and this guy that works for the king, this kind of announcer. And so toward the beginning of the series, the guy that works for him loves the king, and I think wants to be in a romantic relationship with the king. And so they help the situation, and he professes the love. And one of the things that's lovely about this is it teaches kids these wonderful ways of treating reality, things like that. Like they've got this, what do they call it? The crush. If you have a crush on somebody, they call it there's a really cute word for it, about crush fashion or something like that. So you tell the person that you have a crush on them, and one of two things could happen. They could say, oh, me too, or they could say, well, not me. And then when they say either one, all of this overwhelmingness that you can't concentrate on anything else, all of that goes away a little bit. You get to start concentrating on other things after you've done your crush fashion. So, but anyway, the episode that we saw this week that I thought was adorable was the king and the other guy, these two adorable little guys, or I can't tell what sexes they are. They're little, squeaky voice people. They're about to get married. And I have to tell you, there's a lot of Jewishness in this story, not just they'll call each other Bubala. There's a lot of Jewish things that get thrown around in the story. I don't think that it's Jewish, but there's a lot of Jewish things. So they do this part of the wedding that is very similar to what you have to do in a Jewish wedding, where there's this kind of contract stage that you have to do first. And in this one, they have to put their ears, and they have kind of like doggy ears, and they have to put their doggy ears on this tablet that looks like an iPad. And they look at them and they figure out what their astrological sign is. And based on what their true astrological sign is, they figure out if they're compatible or not. And if they're not compatible, according to the astrological sign, it doesn't matter how in love they are with each other, they're not allowed to get married. And so it turns out that when they put their ears on them, their astrological signs were incompatible. So they decide to change the planets because they have this magical power, and they decide to change the planets and realize that doesn't work. Other things changed. It was adorable. It's just adorable. Sorry, I didn't mean to take up so much of time. Number 4, God has a special relationship with Israel. Special relationship. According to Torah, the people of Israel is God's chosen people. What does that mean? You are a people consecrated to Adonai your God. Of all the peoples on the earth, Adonai your God chose you to be God's treasured people. The notion of chosenness, as we know well, is often misunderstood. It implies responsibility, not privilege. The prophet Amos quoted God as saying, "You alone have I singled out of all the families of the earth. That is why I will call you to account for all your iniquities." We have responsibilities. We don't get privileges for this. And Israel, the other way, has a covenant with God. It's a sacred agreement. It's a binding thing. And every generation is bound by that same covenant. Ethical monotheism. This is one that got to me. We're taught that Abraham was the father of monotheism, that he was the first guy who knew something about one God. And that's what we're taught, and we're raised to believe this. And I'm going to tell you that once you grow up and you're a grown up and you look at this, you say, now, wait a minute. How many gods do you think Adam had? More than one? I don't think so. How many gods do you think Noah had? More than one? I don't think so. And Noah was 10 generations before Abraham, and Adam was 10 generations before Noah. So that's 20 generations that we know of where people had a clue that there was only one God. I mean, maybe they also decided to worship other gods, but we know that Adam and Noah only had one God. So what is this about Abraham being the father of monotheism? And the answer is he was the father of this ethical monotheism, and not just monotheism. That God requires ethical behavior, and we hold God to having to be ethical as well. And this is one of the things that Dr. Brill taught, was God expectations are clearly spelled out by the prophet Micah. God has told you, O human, what is good and what God requires of you: to do justice. Think about what it means to do justice. Do the just thing, the thing that's right. To love goodness and to walk humbly with your God. The concept of walking with God, it doesn't say and follow in God's footsteps or anything like that. It says walk with God, walk humbly with God. And God is a personal God. The Torah conceives of God as the creator of the universe, but at the same time, God is very close to us. God is near to all who call to God and all who call God with sincerity. And then it goes on from there to talk about other ways that that God is seen, and you could go look through them. Some of the ways that I wanted to share with you. Let me see. There was one other. This one has a whole bunch of underlinings, but I'm not the one who put the underlinings in it. God believed God is not. So if you look at the modern, there's like Milton Steinberg, was a 20th century rabbi, understood God as a power and a mind. Don't you know people who say that God is kind of this spiritual mind of kind, almost, that there's this spirit of God. It's not necessarily a physical thing, and they'll talk about it kind of almost like a mind, that God enters into relations with the world and particularly with people. But he believed that God is not all powerful. This view is one answer to the age-old question, how could an all-powerful and all-good God create a world in which evil exists? It exempts God from responsibility for the chance events that occur in the universe. And then there's Mordechai Kaplan, believe that God is a force within the natural world, rather one that supernaturally acts upon nature. For Kaplan, God is the sum of everything in the world that renders life significant and worthwhile. Kaplan viewed God as a process, not as a being. God is not the whole universe, but the aspect of the universe that brings human fulfillment. There was this very cool concept in Jewish mysticism that says that God was everything and God is everything. And in order for God to allow any of creation to happen, God had to do this thing that I love. It's called tzimtzum. Tzimtzum. God had to compact God's self to make enough room to be able to allow other things in the universe to exist. And they teach that especially as kind of a leadership trait, that sometimes the best way to allow things to happen is for you to get smaller, you to compact yourself and leave room for other people. Having said that, questions? No? So I'm going to keep prodding along, going. So hopefully out of all of that, one of the things you get from this is that you get to have, I hope you have, this is my personal hope, I hope you have a personal relationship with God. I hope you talk to God. I was at a seminar the other day that we were supposed to talk about prayer and what does it mean to pray and what does it mean when God says no? You know, what does it mean if God says no? But I hope you have a personal, because we had this one guy who would come to Torah study every week and he would say, I do believe that God created the world, but I think that this world is one of many worlds and universes, and that I don't think that God could possibly be paying attention to little old me, since God's responsibilities are so vast. And I don't mind having God, and I don't mind even talking to God, but I don't think God's paying attention to me. And Judaism really does believe that God is paying attention to you. Although over time, there are other concepts also that God is seeing us as a God is seeing it as a whole. We're all in this together, and that sometimes we are, we get rewarded as a whole. That's part of the. Lexi's asking a question: is the Christian concept of the Trinity pure bunk? I cannot speak to that other than to say that it has no place at all in Jewish tradition. All of those things don't apply in Judaism. There is no Trinity of forces or those different parts of God's aspects of God don't play out as separate things. There are times when we do talk about the spirituality of God, but there is no. None of those things exist in Judaism, but I don't want to call it bunk because I am not trying to disprove Christianity here. I'm just trying to teach you what Judaism is. So if I had to disprove Christianity, I would, it has nothing to do with this. It's not this, but Christians can believe that and can find a lot of comfort in that, but it has no place at all in Judaism. Does that help? All right, so prayer, liturgy. So in Judaism, it says there are public and prayer aspects of prayer. Jewish prayer is both set. There are specific things we're supposed to do at specific times or for specific instances, but there's also spontaneous prayer. The Talmud defines prayer as the service of the heart, avodat halev. There are even prayer books called avodat halev, the work of the heart, thus suggesting that prayer should express the deepest feelings and longings of the soul. And I think that that's part of what prayer does, is the soul connects to that spiritual part of God. Through our long history, these longings have taken shape and been formed into a myriad of blessings, brachot, for nearly every occasion. May the Lord bless and keep the Zohar far away from us. We're praying that a lot these days, aren't we? Yeah, far away from us. Both ordinary and extraordinary, fixed liturgy for prescribed times and seasons. There's a blessing for every kind of food we know. There's a blessing for every situation. I am embarrassed to tell you, although I try to see it as a blessing because it's a blessing, there's a blessing for what do you say when you see an ugly person? Did you know that? There's a blessing you say when there are 600,000 people in one place. There's a blessing for being part of that. There's a blessing for what you say when you see a scholar. There's some of those blessings are surprising to me. And most of us who grew up in the Reform movement, and I dare say the conservative movement, are not familiar with all of those blessings. Marla, you grew up like in Cheder, right? Did you ever hear the one about the blessing you're supposed to say every time you see an ugly person, or every time you see a sage, or every time you see 600,000 people in one place? Did they teach you those? Okay, good. Yeah, no, they're there, and they're in a prayer book. They're in the Orthodox. I mean, they're in a traditional prayer book. If you have one of those prayer books that have everything in it, it's in there. And I could show them to you. It's just not necessary because you're entitled to your own spontaneous prayers. And the prayer isn't like you see someone gorgeous and you say, oh God, and you see somebody ugly and you say, oh God. It's not that, and it's not a bad blessing. I should probably have pulled it up before I talked about it. I don't know what made me think about it today. I think I use that as an example all the time because people are surprised to hear it's like the Lord bless and keep the Zohar, that we even have blessings for uncomfortable things. But if you see a rainbow, sometimes you're so in awe, inspired, like breathtaking situation that you don't always remember. You don't always remember what the right blessing is. And Judaism, certainly modern Judaism, accepts whatever is the word that comes out of your heart. It's important to know that public worship is supposed to have, it says public worship is more highly valued than private prayer. It's because Judaism is more than an expression of an individual's faith in God. It's a reflection of the covenantal relationship between God and the Jewish people. Remember that when we came into covenant, I am in covenant with God, but it's not about me. It was part of standing at Sinai, and I saw all of you there, and we saw everybody who lived there then, and all the kids in the family, and everybody, no matter what their status in life was, we saw, or their age or their physical abilities, and we saw everybody throughout time. All of us stood together. It is unique. Most religions, I dare you to find another religion where the covenant between God and the people, or the religious core, is based on everybody being at that actual physical historical moment. I challenge you to find that. I mean, the few current religions that we have, a few people were there when Jesus was, the story about the resurrection, only a few people were there to have experienced that. Muhammad had, it was one guy, there are a few, the Mormon, what was his name, John something, whatever his name was, he, it's just one person at a time. And then you listen to what that one person says. And even when they have beautiful, magnificent things to say, it's still one person at a time. In Judaism, it's all of us. And so being in a minyan helps for that experience. It is what is especially hard during the pandemic. And I am going to tell you that I think that being able to pray on your own is also glorious. And I don't think it should be diminished. Would we like to be praying with other people? Yeah, probably. There's something really cool about the voices. That's very different kind of cool than the Zoom voices. We talked about yarmulke and talit, and I forgot to bring tefillin to show you today. The prayer boxes, the phylactery. Everywhere you go in the world, you will find the prayer service in Hebrew. The Reform movement began a thing where you got to pray in the vernacular also, that you got to hear sermons and the prayers in the vernacular, which means wherever you are, the language or the Jewish language that you're speaking. But everywhere you go in the world, the service is going to follow the same order, and it's going to be based on the Hebrew prayers. There are some denominations of Judaism that are getting away from that. But even when they get away from it, there's a sense of Hebrew as the core, and there's a sense of the order of services as a core. Yes, Marla.
I don't remember as a youngster, because I had to do children's services on Saturday morning for 2.5 hours.
Yeah.
I remember the idea of a sermon in any services. When did that come about?
Well, you'll find that even in your children's services on Shabbat morning, that there would be some kind of like a Devar Torah, some kind of and we can learn from this, here, this is cool that Moses says this, and Moses never said that anywhere else. And this is a lesson we can learn from it. That a lot of times you'll see a Devar Torah, although historically there is a tradition that there were only 2 times during the year when the rabbi would have given an instructional kind of a presentation. So a lot of the concepts of sermons were also stolen from some of our neighbors who did that more, to have lessons. The prayer service itself has enough of a repetition of our values that we didn't necessarily need sermons in those days. We didn't. But I suspect you probably had some kind of a lesson.
Our children's services were student run.
Yeah, but you probably had some kind of a lesson. They would have said, and today's Torah portion is about this, and we could think about this. It could have been small, it could have been really brief, but they probably did something. And so whatever is in your heart, and that was part of, well, in the last class, we talked about the word chesed, the word loving kindness. And part of what the Hasidim gave, Baal Shem Tov was the originator of this beautiful movement where what's in your heart, what's called the kavanah, the intentionality, plays a huge part in successful prayer experiences. So if you don't know the right words to say, but you say this heartfelt thing, and it accomplishes the fact that you're acknowledging that this is a holy moment, according to my concept of Judaism, according to the Reform movement, the conservative movement, the Reconstructionist movement, according to the Hasidic movement, that should be enough. It doesn't have to be that you know the specific words. I think that once you get to orthodoxy, there's and in gradations all the way down. There is an expectancy to know the right thing to do. But so it depends on which direction we're talking about. You know, that story about there's a ladder that goes from heaven to earth, and there's a guy 2 rungs from the top, and there's a guy 2 rungs from the bottom, and which one is better? And the answer is it depends which way they're going. So it's a similar kind of thing, that if you should know better, if you should know that this is what you say when you're about to eat an apple, and you intentionally say something else, and your whole world is filled with needing to do what's conventionally appropriate, then it may be a bad thing that you're doing. You may be doing this intentionally to be a bandit, to intentionally, you know, be doing the wrong thing, means that that's not appropriate. But if you're in a world where you're just trying the best you can, and you don't know what the right words are, you didn't even know there were right words to say. Every time you see a rainbow, you say the Shema, because the Shema is the most important thing you know, and it's all you know. And you say the Shema, and the Shema means nothing about rainbows, but you're trying to thank God, and the Shema has nothing to do with thanking God, and you say those words anyway. I can't imagine you not getting mitzvah points. The points I already told you we don't have. Lexi?
So basically, if I'm in whatever moment, especially since I've gotten Bentley, hey, I'll just be playing with them, and it's just like look up and say thank you.
That sounds like a blessing, a prayer to me. That sounds like a prayer. And those are good moments. And you know, there's a tradition in Judaism to say 100 blessings every day. And I've got books on my shelf with 100 blessings, so that you could try to accomplish all of those. I bet we could make an app that you could check off which blessing you said by the end of the day, and look for those moments where you get to say your blessings.
I could probably do that on a daily basis without even needing a prayer book.
That's the point. That's exactly my point. My point is, you don't have to have that app. I could picture someone wanting to say these 100 blessings plus some maybe, but that's how you get into those situations, like when you've got the Father and the Son, and they're walking down the road, and there's a mitzvah that says that if you see a bird sitting on its eggs and you're hungry, you're allowed to shoo the mother bird. You're obligated to shoo the mother bird away, and then you can take the eggs. And there are people who look to try to fulfill all of the commandments. That's a commandment. It is something I have never done. I have never shooed a bird away, not even a chicken, from its egg to be able to get it. I mean, maybe somebody shooed the chicken away so I could have the egg, and I've eaten eggs, but I have never done it. So if I feel this obligation to complete as many mitzvot as I can, because that's what the obligation is for being Jewish, is God gave us these mitzvot and we try to do it. I would look for a way to do that. So there are people with that kind of a mentality, that kind of a drivenness, that may say, well, what are the 100 blessings that I should strive to say? And I give you a list, and then you try to do those. And that could work, but I am not that kind of person. I just try to find opportunities to be grateful, to connect with my people now and through the past. There are times when I'm praying for things like peace or safety or health, and I pray for those things, and I don't expect that God is going to answer with what I told God to do, but I do feel like I really want it, and I think that I like to think that the fact that I say it makes God listen better.
So with the blessings before a meal, I ended up going to finding an original on the Chabad site, and they have a blessing for each. There's like 6 blessings, one for bread.
That's on my site too, yeah. And so the point is, there's a hierarchy. If you're eating a bread meal, we've talked about this before. If you eat a bread meal,
what is you getting confused though with what blessings to say depending on the combination of meal? Do you have to say those blessings word for word, or can you just throw up whichever in your heart and say thank you for the meal?
Well, so what's your goal here, Lexi? Is your goal to try to learn the blessings and say them all correctly? Then you might want to try to say the blessings and say them correctly. If your goal is to acknowledge that when you eat food, you're going to be grateful to God, then say what's in your heart, and then you've hit that goal. And one of, I'm gonna have to get off. That's a call I'm gonna have to take in a sec. One of the things that we talked about for food blessings, by the way, is that there's a hierarchy. If you're having bread, you don't say any of the other foods, even though you're appreciative that you have all of them on your plate. Let's say you've got one of each. You may be appreciative, but you say the bread blessing and you don't say any of the others. And that's the way it is done. And there's reasons, and I can give it to you, but if you choose not to, are you breaking the law and God's going to call that a sin? I doubt it.
What if bread is part of a combination item, say a slice of pizza?
Then, well, it depends. So that's a specific question. And the answer is, if you're having a slice of pizza or 2 slices of pizza and it's a snack, then there's a special blessing that you say for the snack. And if it's a meal, then there's a special blessing you say for the meal. But either way, that one blessing would cover it for either of those situations. You don't have to say a blessing for the mushrooms and the black olives and the tomatoes and the cheese, and that you don't have to say a blessing for all of that. So it will depend on what your purpose is. And then the blessing you say after the meal is going to be affected by that too. But the point here is,
That you simplified my life.
yeah, the point here is say blessing. Find ways to be grateful. Find ways to thank God. Find ways to talk to God. Interact with God. Interact with history. Recognize that you are part of a history that goes back to Abraham and probably even before that. Recognize those things. All right, I have to stop this recording. We've gone to our